Welcome back to the X Podcast, and here at the Knights of the Round Table with Zachary Clean Shaven Brown and Timothy Charlemagne Moore.
I don't think that is a compliment.
Charlemagne? Charlemagne's a
That's like
heroic
a
king.
month. No, it's not Timothy Chalamet. Chalamet.
That's okay. That's a
He's
difference.
like a model-esque actor. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's not what I heard.
That was a compliment.
So that's why I missed that.
Oh,
He's talking about the.
I definitely heard Charlemagne.
I
Yeah,
probably
that's
said that.
That's who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, then I take it. And we are at the rectangle table. We're Knights of the Rectangle.
Table.
Knights of the Rectangular Table.
Yes, we are.
What have you been doing the last hour?
What have I been doing?
No surprise if you watch our podcast that we are recording a second episode.
Yeah.
And so we don't know when this one's coming out.
All right. How's the family life? You got a busy, full home.
We do have a busy full
Young kids and a Disney wife.
young kids and a Disney wife. We have
Old kids and a Disney wife.
dealing with. How about this? We've been dealing with a new refrigerator.
And you were what?
Refrigerator.
Refrigerator.
Yeah, I came back from vacation and our refrigerator was toast.
Oh.
And
That's a wordplay.
you and I.
Refrigerator went hot.
Yeah.
Refrigerator became a toaster.
You and I talked about the death of customer service in this
Yeah.
country. Dude, the customer service and trying to
whoa. Don't mention
don't
the brand.
Okay. We won't,
Wait,
we don't
why?
want to be liable.
Oh,
we don't
really?
be liable.
What you need to do is go to Vance Refrigeration.
Vance.
Not JD Vance,
No,
but
not
Vance
JD
Refrigeration
Vance.
from
No.
the office.
Yeah.
No.
I'll talk to Phyllis.
Okay. Yeah, you do that.
Okay.
Is this an Office reference?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. It's just going over
Have you
my
not
head.
seen The Office?
I've never seen The Office all the way through.
Well,
Why-
wait,
why
like
do
all
we-
the way through 9 seasons,
Yeah, all the
or
way
through
through 9
one
seasons.
episode?
All the way through.
Why do we
9
keep
seasons.
allowing him around this table?
Yeah, good
What?
point. You need to go watch more episodes.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so your
So-
refrigerator became toast.
Yeah, it became toast, and we have been dealing with getting it fixed, and it's been a lot of fun.
Man.
Yeah.
Mm.
Not fun.
What
So-
about you?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Well, I spent last week, not when we would have, you're watching this,
Like
when we
we
were
were
recording this, I spent last week in Georgia, preached for our friend Leggett, who was on this podcast a few years back,
Mhm.
at his church on Sunday in Atlanta, and then did a youth camp all week in North Georgia, Monday through Thursday. Got deathly sick. Ruined my day in the city, but got to hang out with some friends during the week. But postponed my flight. Got back late Saturday. Been surviving and
Sharing your COVID with everybody.
sharing my whatever I have with my beloved
Is
friends.
COVID a thing anymore?
You know,
Technically, probably it is.
yes.
Is it
There's
a
the
thing
new
now
variants they're talking about all the time. There's a summer variant. What is it?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Really?
No.
Actually, you know
I
that
think we've kind of all
you know
put
what the
that
summer variant is
away.
called? One of them is called flirt. It's literally
Oh.
called flirt.
Flirt?
Yes.
How do you know that? Why do you know that?
Well, because just like you,
Do you
I
flirt
see
with
the.
COVID?
He was researching all of his symptoms. And came up
Honestly,
with flirt.
Actually, speaking at a youth camp of 200
Fever,
kids, I probably was flirting with COVID all week.
Indigestion. I'm trying to make an acronym. Out of
Oh,
flirt.
he was trying to make an acronym out of flirt.
Oh, okay.
Fever.
Flatulence.
wow.
Well, fever. Sorry,
Okay.
fever.
Okay. People are going to be turning this off real
Yeah.
fast here. So I have a question
Okay.
that I want to bring to both of you. So I was on Instagram the other day and just scrolling, and there's someone I follow coming out with a new book. Okay. And the title of the book is called Toxic Empathy. And the phrase kind of stuck out to me a little bit. And where I want to ask this question really has nothing to do with, I think, what the book is actually going to be about. So take that for what you will. But the phrase stuck out to me. And it stuck out to me because around this table, we talk a lot about the power of empathy. And what does it look like to have empathy for people who have different views than you, people who think differently than you, or who have gone through tough situations or what have you. And but the phrase toxic empathy, and we often view empathy in a positive light, but toxic is a really negative word. And so it got me thinking, can empathy be toxic? Can you have too much of it? Can it be a hindrance in any sort of way? And it just started just bouncing a lot of things off in my brain. So I want to bring that question to this table and just start the discussion there with both of you.
Well, I'll let him answer it, but before I do, just give a
Me.
quick cultural observation that it seems like we're in a day and age where when anything's called toxic, the person describing it just finds that particular thing toxic. It seems like most people that talk about toxic masculinity all the time just think masculinity is toxic, and I have a feeling this person who thinks talks about toxic empathy probably just
Does
thinks
this have
empathy is
anything to do
toxic.
because of the author versus the book title? Or
It's just a cultural
Yeah.
observation.
Just saying.
So anyways, I just
Pretty
want to
funny.
point that out.
Yeah,
Usually
There
whatever,
might be some truth to that
yeah,
it
in
could
this
be.
situation.
I think whatever you're railing against the most reveals something about you.
Yeah. It's good.
Also makes you wonder if. Never mind. I'm not gonna say it. I just caught myself. This is a filter. Okay, so you asked a question like it seems to be putting two things that are almost opposites. One,
Yes.
empathy is usually always seen in a positive light,
Yes.
with toxicity, which is always seen in a negative light, right? This is not the first time that this happens. Obviously, you know, I mean, we've seen this with other things, but like for example, I remember years ago just learning about toxic generosity. So there's such a thing as toxic giving. And that is this idea that your giving is actually hurting someone. Usually, this is used whenever, and again, there's some books and some things out there for churches, other nonprofits and things going, well, you know, just giving can, to somebody who is in great need, depending on how it's done, can also be enabling, right? We have people that come to us as a church all the time asking for handout, asking for money. And we at times do help. We've helped a lot of people throughout
Yeah.
the
A
years.
lot of
A lot of
times,
times
weekly.
we do.
Yeah.
I mean, we get a lot of requests and we help a lot of times, but we first investigate every situation because we don't want to be a part of what's toxic giving, which means you're just perpetuating the state in which they're in. Like if we can help somebody get out of that state, we want to, but it's, you know, it's like somebody who comes to us and goes, and we get this sometimes, you know, hey, I need $800 or they're going to shut my electricity off, or I need this, or I'm going to get kicked out of my apartment, right? Which means that you haven't paid rent for 4 months or 5, you know. And so we'll go in and look at it, and the bleeding heart part of us, and there is a bleeding heart part of us, when you hear something that is that urgent, and so maybe this fits with the empathy. It's like, I want to help. We got to help this situation immediately. But what we have found, and this is going to be maybe a poor use of resources that we try to manage well and steward well, is that if that person that maybe is living or has been in a perpetuated state like this does not have a plan or a way of fixing the problem, then you are delaying the inevitable. So you give them some money and they're able to keep the lights on for 1 more month. But when you investigate and find out, how are you solving this problem? Like if you have to pay the electric bill or you've got to pay the mortgage or rent this month, what are you going to do next month? And when you find out that there are some people that have no plan, they're not working towards something, we will that's sometimes considered toxic giving. You are kind of perpetuating that, and that person, they just go from the next church to the next nonprofit to the next place, and that's how they kind of live. And versus instead of a handout, how do we give a hand up? How do we help somebody? But so we'll challenge people. It's like, hey, if you want to come in and meet with a financial person, we'll be happy to sit down and help you do that. And most of the time, they're like, okay, no thanks, I don't need your help. They didn't want help. They wanted money. They wanted a handout. And so the reason why I bring up that as a scenario is because it kind of fits with this idea of toxic empathy, maybe, be my guess.
Maybe.
Is can you ever get to a point where you are so empathetic that it's not helpful for the person? And I think that's an interesting question. It's an interesting concept. I mean, it's hard to imagine empathy to a level that is not helpful, because to me, empathy is really just trying to put yourself in that person's shoes. It's feeling what they may be feeling. It's you internalizing what it must be like for them in that scenario. Empathy is not an action. It leads to an action, in my opinion, but empathy is actually something that you feel that will move someone to action.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question is, I don't know if the feeling or the response of empathy is ever toxic. I think potentially how you respond or what you do, I want to say, could be toxic.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I mean, that's possible. I don't know.
That's interesting.
Yeah, what you just said last, I think, was probably where I was going to go. It's just that I think, yes, can almost anything be distorted? Of course, the idea of love is powerful as it is. If it is processed through dysfunction, can have an unhealthy manifestation of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, like when you were unpacking toxic generosity, which is a very interesting thing to process. That is an action, whereas empathy, I don't think, in a weird way, it reminds me of, when Francis Chan was talking about the Holy Spirit, and he was talking about people that have been turned off by wildly charismatic people. And he was like, you may think that it's possible to have too much of the Holy Spirit. He goes, I promise you've never met somebody who has too much of the Holy Spirit. What you've met is people who do too many weird things in the name of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And maybe similar way, I think with empathy, it is impossible to have too much empathy, because empathy is the powerful virtue of putting yourself in the shoes of another human being. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that can ever be had in an excess that's unhealthy. I think it is simply what you choose to do with that empathy. And it is hard, just to be honest, for me to take out of my mind the people that write and talk about these things. I'm not saying this doesn't exist to a healthy extent, but I got to be honest, everybody I've ever heard rail against empathy just seems to lack it.
Mm.
So...
well said.
That makes it hard for me
Yeah.
to say, to really take with validity their content. But to your point, what I do think you could say is, wherever you have an extreme measure of kindness, of love, of empathy, if that is not met in the application with wisdom, things can go sideways.
Yeah.
So you can be the most loving person in the world, and you want to love your spouse, love your kids, love people well. But if your application of love does not contain wisdom, then absolutely there can be toxic, catastrophic results.
Yeah.
And I think the same with empathy. If empathy, first of all, I think it's really easy for empathy to be conflated with sympathy.
Mm.
And sympathy really doesn't have any practical execution to it that's helpful to anybody. But empathy does. Empathy is I think, a superpower that we actually need more of. And I think the problem with our world is not that we have too much empathy. I don't think anybody that honestly is living in our society and wants to see the world be healthier and has a heart that breaks for people and turns on the news and sees the spirit of our society can honestly come to the conclusion we just have too much empathy. Too many people are really trying to consider the other person's point of view. I mean, I would love for an intelligent person to look me in the eye and say, I really just think too many people are trying to consider other people's feelings. And I think too many people in our culture are obviously trying to understand other people's perspective. And I really think other people are really just caring about the weight that other people are carrying too much. That's the problem with our society.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I think the problem is the inverse.
Yeah.
But I do think if we don't incorporate wisdom in the application of that in our personal lives, things can go sideways.
Yeah. So you both mentioned you mentioned wisdom, and you mentioned how empathy can lead to action. I think that's true. And we spent a lot of time. You guys spent a lot of time and talking about ways you can grow your empathy, ways you can put yourself in other people's shoes. But talk to me a little bit about ways we think that empathy, I guess the actions of empathy can be toxic.
Well,
like
okay, I have a couple of scenarios that are floating in my head.
Yeah.
And I think my guess is, without knowing anything other than the fact what you just said about this person's book, and I know nothing about it, so I don't even know if this is their approach, but I would imagine this would be a scenario that might show up. I remember this kind of debate when there was a lot of talk about Christian nationalism and things going on. And so one of the things that I would imagine, maybe even this person would suggest, toxic empathy could look like this. you send a bunch of money and aid to other countries to help them, but you're not helping your own country. Do you remember when all of the stuff was coming out about like really this idea of take care of your own house first
America
before
first.
you take care of others? I would, again, I don't know if that's it, but I'm saying that to me could be what somebody's alluding to of this idea of toxic empathy, where you know there's policies even. There's a nation where you're like, okay, we're sending billions and billions of dollars over to help address this issue over there, but we're not addressing our own issue, and we have our own poverty, and we have our own situations right here in America.
You know who the symbol of toxic empathy is then? The Statue of Liberty. It says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, your immigrants that are not living here yet, but that are dying in brokenness and starvation. It's the first thing that pops in my mind. I'm like, man, the Statue of Liberty is, according to that definition, just the emblem of toxic empathy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only place that my mind and scenario where I guess I would see somebody would have a problem with empathy is that if you're doing it at the expense of something or someone else. So it's, and I guess to an extent, I can understand that. I mean, I think, for example, and we've seen situations like this, anecdotal stories and things like this, right? It's the person that has such a bleeding heart for a broken situation that it's like, I just can't stand that there are these, you know, it'd be like, imagine you're a father and you have 2 daughters at home and you got this thing going, I just can't stand that there are these homeless boys on the street, and so I'm going to bring 3 of them. I don't know anything about them, but I'm going to house them and put them in my house.
Yes. Yeah.
But that could be dangerous.
Right?
You got daughters in your house, you got this, you don't know who they are, you don't know their character, you don't know any of this, right? And so there is probably a level to which you do need healthy boundaries when it comes to empathy. That the toxic part might not be that you're empathetic towards somebody else in their situation. The toxic part might be the end result of what it causes other damage in your own life. That I think could be a potential.
You know, that's very valid. I mean, I have a lot of, I'm just going to, you know, we haven't Enneagrammed it. Well, I got a lot of Enneagram 2s in my life. And so this is a normal conversation.
Yes.
My friend, I won't say her name. You have 9 kids. You gotta also make sure that you take care of yourself. Right. And you know, I got friends in my life that bleeding heart syndrome. Can take them. The unhealthy, and to me, maybe I just don't love the phrasing toxic empathy. But to me, it's a misplaced and unwise exchange when you onboard a burden. I'm just going to use spiritual language that God didn't give you to bear. And or another unhealthy thing, you onboard a burden to the negligence of your own care and health. I think those would be the 2 biggest ways they manifest in personal lives. And I think that's really tough. And I think a lot of people really struggle with that.
I think it's interesting. You brought up the word boundaries. You're talking about the way you care about other people, and I do think it can be hard to know, like where's the boundary in my life between, okay, how much is too much? Like, and we're in a faith context, and so we've heard things like, you know, to follow Jesus is to love your neighbor. Okay, so where's the boundary between loving my neighbor and also operating with wisdom and creating space for myself and creating that space? I think that can be a hard tension for a lot of people to manage and to know, okay, how far can my empathy take me? Or when do I need to draw a line and say, that's not my burden, in your language, for me to carry or to bear?
It's probably the property line.
The boundary line is literally the property line.
Yeah, that's probably the property line.
If
That's
it's on their property
yeah.
line, it's not my problem.
It is.
I need to mow my neighbor's yard because his grass is high. Oops, I killed his yard. I shouldn't have done that. No, it's like
it is very tricky, and I think a lot of it depends. I think the younger, can I just say this? This makes me sound old. The younger you are, the more you want to make this really cut and dry for people, right? And you want to give cut and dry. And there are parameters and principles that hopefully we can pull out of this conversation. But, like one acknowledgement of this probably would be the Sabbath, keeping a day where you are, which is I think a great practice to have a day a week where you guard your life. But I think some people, when they first discover boundaries, go so far in this extreme, it almost borders more into self-indulgence and an overprotectiveness. And so you have to figure out, I think, where you're at on the spectrum. I think based on personality type, to be honest, I think almost all of us, based on our personality type, need the opposite challenge at times. I think there are people that are actually really great at boundaries, and they're not going to do anything they don't ever want to do. And I think for them, the challenge of health is being a little bit more sacrificial, and a little bit more selfless, and a little bit more service oriented. Whereas somebody that maybe really struggles with ever drawing the line and is always bleeding heart towards people is like, no, I need to exercise the muscle to say no. I also think like part of it comes back to like our capacity. How much can we honestly carry and be healthy? Because the cycle of an unhealthy rhythm of it is I want to be loving, but because I don't know how to navigate my schedule and my spirit and my capacity and my boundaries, I end up becoming unhealthy and therefore unloving to the people closest to me.
Yeah.
And I've seen that become a cycle. And then some people just seem to have unlimited capacity. It's so funny. I always, I don't know if I've told this story before in here, but there's a guy named Bob Goff.
Yep.
New York Times bestselling author. He was the U.S. consul to Uganda, all this kind of stuff. And he has the opposite approach of almost every modern guru. He was like, Jesus was available to humanity, and I want to be too. And he just makes himself widely available. And he put his actual cell phone number, have I told you this story? At the back of his first book. His publisher said, you cannot do this. You cannot put your number at the back of your book. And he said, no, I wanted to. Jesus was available to people. I want to be available to people. I read his first book, Love Does, thought it was amazing. It actually really impacted me, like on a really personal level. And then when I was living in Lexington, as part of a church plant, he spoke at like a mega church nearby. And he talked about this in his book. He was like, I just want to be available to people. I put my number in the back of it. And it's been crazy. It's been amazing. I can't get anything done. And he's laughing about it. He's like, and I remember like 2 weeks later, I'm in like my early 20s. I go on like the sabbatical of sorts to Thomas Merton's monastery or whatever. And then we're going off the rails, but it hopefully be worth it. And I had just gone through kind of something, and I thought about one of his chapters that inspired me. I'm like, I'm going to try to call Bob Goff. So I go to the back of the book. I call him. He didn't answer. I leave a message, whatever. So I end up leaving this like monastery place in Bardstown, Kentucky, in the mountains early, going to Charleston, and kind of just relaxing there the rest of the week. And while I'm getting ready to drive back to Greenville, my cell phone rings, LAX. And I'm like, hello. And he goes, Russ, it's Bob.
No.
What are you doing? And I said, Bob Goff? He goes, yeah, got your number, man. I'm so glad you called. What else going on in your life? And he spent 15 to 20 minutes unrushed and just poured into my life. And it left such an impact on me.
Wait, did you keep his contact in your phone?
Yeah, I got it.
Text him right now and see if he responds. Hey, Bob, on a podcast, just talking about that time when you called me and from your phone number in the back of your book. How you doing? You want to be on our podcast? Ask him. I may not ask him if he wants to be on the podcast. I'm just shocked. Wouldn't it be hilarious if during this podcast he responded?
Bob Goff responded.
Russ, I remember that. Well, all right, he's texting Bob Goff right now.
There he is.
We're going to see.
We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see.
All right.
So your point being,
My point being,
you can never be empathetic enough.
I've thought about, my point being, sometimes I think, and many times from necessity, we swing on pendulums in society based on the need. And I think that we are in a societal moment where there's a lot of, look, of probably any book I buy for people, because it's so funny, kind of like Leonard Ravenhill, I actually consider like specific prayerful book purchasing for people in ministry. I love, like, when I'm meeting with people, thinking of what would be the book that could be timely life-changing for them. And if there's any book, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, that I have either gifted or recommended, probably more than any other, it is Dr. Henry Cloud's classic Boundaries.
Yeah.
And it is so important. And why are you laughing?
I was going to ask you which the next book was.
I actually want to do something fun with y'all at the end about this.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
But and so I think it's so important. I had somebody literally last week was like, "Hey, I recommend it or buy it so many times I forget." They're
Right.
like, "Hey, I finished his book and it's been game changing for me."
Yeah.
And I think it's
And
so
that is a good
important.
resource. I read it a long, long time ago, but that's a resource that all of us would encourage people. If you've never,
Yeah.
you need a book resource, right? Boundaries
Yes.
by Dr. Henry Cloud.
Yeah,
Yep.
he's a clinical psychologist, but also faith-based, practical, powerful. And by the way, the beautiful thing about it is it's kind of a supernatural story how it came to even exist. But it was such a runaway success that there's so many spinoffs. There's Boundaries for parents, Boundaries for kids, Boundaries
Yeah.
for pastors, Boundaries for spouses. Like there's
Yeah.
all. I mean, no matter where
Yeah.
you're at in life. I mean, I met with someone a couple months ago that's struggling. That they're older, and they're in their late 20s, but they're living with their parents. But it's not the healthiest situation. They don't want to be there long, but they're trying to figure out. I'm like, boundaries. Read Boundaries.
Yeah.
How do you love well but stand firm? You know, how do you?
That's a difficult thing to do.
You
So
know?
maybe that's what the idea of toxic masculinity could be. It's that what you just said. How do you love well but also stand firm?
Toxic masculinity? You mean
Oh,
toxic?
sorry, toxic empathy. I
Yeah.
said, which I think those are obviously going back. I think they're weird words to put together. I think it's a false dichotomy, kind of creating out of it
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't. When I was thinking as you were talking, I was like, I don't know that I see any place in the gospel accounts where Jesus would ever have invited them to like not be empathetic, or there could be too much. Even I want to say almost even to his detriment.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I'm saying is that idea of even protecting yourself, and that is even hard to draw in the gospel accounts with Jesus. I think about him going to Samaritan town, and they're going in to get food, and they come back, and he's ministering to this woman. And they're like, "Here, aren't you hungry?" And he's like, "No, I've got food that you don't know about." So he's even not eating where he's at. I think about when John the Baptist gets killed. And Jesus says, "Come on, guys." After they were on, say, "Come, let's go away and rest." And all the people follow him, and he gets to the other end. They try to get away, and all these people show up, and he sees them. And he has compassion, and what does he do? He holds an entire full day long service, ends up feeding them. Like you just cannot get a model from Jesus of being too empathetic.
Yeah.
In general, and I'm not saying that we still shouldn't practice wisdom when it comes to this. And to me, the only thing I fall into where not me personally, but I think is a warning when it comes to this idea of empathy motivated actions where you see a need and you just have to. I think we have to be a little bit careful of not having the Superman.
Yeah.
The Superman complex.
I can fix everything.
I can save them. I can do this. I think that can be a dangerous thing. I think when empathy goes too far, if there is such a thing, it could be when we move into a Superman complex and and we kind of think I am their savior, to maybe the detriment of responsibilities and other things that you have.
Oh,
You know,
I
it's
mean,
like-
even
it's
to the extent, I think this is how a lot of, is even in ministry, like how a lot of moral failures happen. I think our empathy, everything comes from the soil of what's inside us. So even something as beautiful as empathy, if it's coming out of unhealthy soil,
yeah.
is tainted with the other junk inside. So how many, pastors, male or female, have had somebody with the opposite sex?
Yeah.
They're in a broken, vulnerable state.
Counseling.
And then empathy
Build up.
without wisdom of guardrails, boundaries, actions can lead to destruction.
Yeah.
And so, that's just where I think that's the place where empathy and wisdom have to meet.
So
Empathy
the
and
boundary.
strength
Empathy
and
with a
wisdom.
boundary.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is all good stuff, and I think it is very true and helpful. I'm curious. I want to put you on the spot, because I think this is good, but I think this is hard for people. I think it's hard to hold these two in tension.
Yeah.
Because that's really what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is holding the love, but also the wisdom and tension with where you go and how you operate.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about how well do you think you do personally with this, and then what are just give me some Russ tips, tricks, like things that you've uncovered in your life to manage this tension or to like like figured out because it's a journey. I think that's the
Sure.
one thing we want to talk about. You're not just going to get good at this.
No.
Boundaries take a long time to
Mhm.
learn how to set them, where to set them, how to
Mhm.
implement. I don't even think Dr. Cloud mentioned that in his book. They
Mhm.
take a long time to actually to get comfortable with them.
Mhm.
Talk to me a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, I think from a ministry calendar perspective, I think one of the things that helped me early on is I had mentors and pastors. I remember the person who became my youth pastor and that I ended up, following to help plant a church. His pastor that hired him in Greer, South Carolina, who grew a church from 5 people to 2,000 people, basically said, I ran myself out of a job because I did the old school church thing where I had to be at every single person's funeral, every single person's thing. He said, and I burnt myself out and I almost lost my marriage and I lost my sanity. And so he went through a process where it was like, okay, what does it look like? That whole thing that I think is kind of normal language now of I'm not going to sacrifice my family on the altar of ministry. I'm going to actually, and so, I think that, and then throughout the years, the whole idea of Sabbath and all that, I think what that's done for me, one of the things I've hopefully done well is I have given myself permission, when the weekend comes, to actually replenish my soul. And what that practically means is it is weird when you're in ministry and you love people. It's not a division of your life. It is your life.
Yeah.
And so like the people here, they're not my job. They're my community.
Yeah.
They're my people.
Yeah.
They're my friends. Tommy, I'm going to give him a shout. He said the greatest compliment I've ever heard, I think, about ministry the other day. I've never thought of it like this. We were at the gym and he was like, you know what you get to do for a living? You get to serve your friends. And I was like, I love that perspective. I get to serve my friends.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't stop on the weekends.
Yeah.
And if, in Jesus' language, a donkey falls into a ditch, if there's an emergency and somebody loves life. But for better or worse, for a long time now, 10 to 15 years now, I do not feel guilt over not meeting on the weekends over a non-emergency if somebody has a theological frustration or something that could be handled on a Monday or whatever. Like I'm never rude. But I don't feel bad about saying no. I'm going to take time to replenish. So that's a practical thing that I think has been put in my mind over the last 10 to 15 years. That's been helpful. I think on a personal level because of the way I'm wired, and because of I feel like a lot of the conflict resolution stuff I had to do in like management roles and when I was doing retail and grocery chains or whatever. I think those jobs equip me with the tools, I think, to have conversations that combine with my personality and hopefully maybe a little bit of confidence. John Maxwell says you teach people how to treat you. So I think I've hopefully tried to find that line over the years of I want to be the most kind, loving, humble person towards people. But if I don't stand up for myself, no one will. Mm-hmm. I think where to be transparent, like if you're asking, okay, how do you deal with all that? I think where I struggle and still don't do well at times is if I'm really close to somebody, really close to somebody and there's ongoing tension. I think sometimes because I know I don't mind to confront, I will let an issue or a disagreement or a tension go on for too long because I so don't want to say the wrong thing or I don't want to hurt the relationship. And so I think where I've maybe not set a strong enough boundary for self-respect is I will at times with someone I'm close with let something go on too long. And that's where I'm always trying to find that tension. So I'm just processing. I've not arrived in this for sure. Yeah. And because so there's parts of this I'm constantly, there's a lot of this I feel like, no, I know how I operate there. Mm-hmm. And there's parts of this issue that, I'm still kind of like, I want to be slow to speak. Yeah. Wisdom is slow to speak. But then when certain things go on too long, the lack of wisdom is you've not addressed something and now it's so late that it's built into this. and going back and addressing it feels like a resentment. And so I think that's some of my, I don't know if that answers
No,
or
it's good.
that's helpful at all.
It's helpful. No,
Yeah.
a lot of good things. Do you have any
Yeah.
tips or tricks?
Well,
things you've learned?
some of the things that, I mean, again, I want to try to, because I think the majority of the people that probably listen or watch you probably are in ministry. So, where this can translate, maybe it'll help. I don't know. I remember same kind of thing about schedule, just someone tell me a long time ago, because I think when you first get into ministry, you're there to serve and you want to be available and you want to help because people are coming to you. They don't know what else to do and who else to talk to. And so they're coming to you. So I think number one, you have to watch against the hero complex, right?
Yes.
The savior complex, because we are not that.
Yeah.
But I remember somebody coming, and at first in ministry doing it, I remember like people wanting to meet or connect, and it was always at the expense of this evening, this weekend day, this whatever. And I would rationalize it in my head and go, well, they work full-time job too. Right? So I need to meet them on that. And I had someone tell me once, this was years ago, and they said that, it's more about kind of understanding boundaries. And they're like, no, you need to understand, if they want to meet with you badly enough, they'll make it happen. If it's that important to them, you know what I mean? Like you aren't the hero to fix this. They're asking for your time. I think some of it comes to understanding kind of what your role is, what you do, and realizing just because I'm a pastor to a church doesn't mean that I'm available 24/7 to everybody in the church. And so some of that is just taking some time to kind of learn that. There's other places where I think boundaries are really healthy to have. I mean, we have some basic boundaries here. I don't counsel any women on my own. I rarely do it anyways. And if there's a woman that is like, oh, can I meet with Pastor Tim? I really wanted to, if it's somebody in a situation maybe I know and they really specifically, which I did with somebody probably about 3 months ago. I'm like, yeah, I won't meet with you alone though. There needs to be someone else in the room. So we had somebody else that's in the room. So I think trying to protect, I think boundaries are there. Boundaries boundaries exist for two primary purposes. One, to keep certain things out or certain people out. And it's also to protect what's inside. And so I think, understanding that is kind of helpful, has been helpful for me. I think you can cross this over to your own, whatever you do, whatever your life. I think there comes a point where you like, here's like an example. This is a scenario people are going to have, right? You have a friend who really needs your help on Friday and doesn't have a lot of help. And so they're asking you for help on Friday, but Friday, your kid has a football game. What do you do? Right? That's a difficult tension. And to me, I think the way you navigate those kind of things where you have empathetic requests, like it's like, I would hate to be in that person's shoes. They're all by themselves. They don't have anybody else to help them. They don't have a lot of friends. They're asking me for help. I have an ability, all those things. I want to first, if you do not have a predefined set of priorities in your life, then you will probably just cave to whatever empathy request or anything that pulls, right?
That's
So,
really good.
so I think you need to have predefined. What is the priority in your life? And that's been a work in progress for me, and I think just anybody that gets into ministry, because you feel so responsible in ministry. You feel a weight. And again, I'm not saying you don't in other careers, similar thing, depending on what you do, that it's really hard to say no to people because you feel like you're letting them down. But what I've learned a little bit over time myself is that my biggest problem with letting other people down is usually I care more about their opinion of me than anything else. And so there had to come some moments where I'd realize, do I care more about the opinion of my family than I do this person that's outside of my family? And and they need me too. And so I've had to, it's a tension to, it doesn't mean I don't ever connect and meet in this, but I don't want to do it at the expense of costing something to my family or that. And I think that, if anything, if we're trying to take these two words and put them together, I think that, if anything, can be where a boundary helps you to keep from.
I also think, when we talk about wisdom, if wisdom is pattern recognition, the longer you go about this kind of stuff, the longer you also detect patterns of the kind of people that you need to set boundaries with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Coming from.
Because I think the longer I go, the more I'm like, yeah, I don't want to have like a gut. I don't want to just have like a
Yeah.
knee-jerk reaction off a gut level feeling. But at times I'm like, I've gotten to the point with some scenarios that I'm like, yeah, I'm actually more comfortable with drawing a boundary early on
Yes.
because history has taught me if I don't, this is just going to get annoying.
Yeah.
And this is just going to be draining and this is going to be unhealthy. But I do think it is that thing of like, I think you're in a really healthy place if in your heart and life, empathy is growing
Mm-hmm.
at the same rate that your strength and wisdom is growing. Where I want to be the person that I'm always loving people more, always. I don't want to be the person that's just, I don't want to be the busy pastor. I hate it when I feel like that. I'm the
Yeah.
busy pastor
Yeah.
that doesn't see people.
Yeah.
And my gut level reaction is, how do I efficiency this away?
Mm-hmm.
I want to be the person that Philip Yancey said Jesus was outrageously, wonderfully interruptible. It's like, how do I be
Mm-hmm.
that person who, yes, has boundaries and is organized and efficient, but is wonderfully interruptible
Mm-hmm.
in a responsible way?
Yeah.
But at the same time, my pattern recognition shows me, okay, this is, I love that. I think one great phrase I've always tried to come back to is there's a difference between being responsible to someone and for someone. So I think for me, a big part of how you set boundaries is, what am I responsible to and what am I responsible for?
Yeah.
So if I meet with someone, I think a great boundary, I love this boundary, I've tried this at times, is before I meet with this person again,
Yeah.
I'm not responsible for their follow-up actions. So if they're wanting me to quote unquote, I don't know,
Yeah.
counsel or coach them,
Yeah.
then okay, I did this. I was telling, a few months ago, I said, hey, so I'll meet with you again. I do have some, but set up our next appointment once you've done A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And what that does is it sets it up to where it's like, no, there's a responsibility on both sides.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so I think that's one way just to make sure. And I know this breaks down for a lot of people for a lot of people, it's like my in-laws, right? How do I set boundaries with my in-laws? Or how do I set boundaries with my parents or with my siblings or with my,
Yeah.
I think that's where and y'all could probably speak to that way more than I could, but it's like, I think for a lot of people, you just have to decide like what is healthy
Yeah.
for what God has given me responsibility for.
Mm-hmm.
And then how do I also be loving and empathetic? I brought this book because speaking of book recommendations, it's called The Hidden Peace by Joel, don't know how to say his last name, Muddamall. He's the theological researcher for Lisa Turkhurst, but it's an entire book on the power of humility. And it's really good. And he builds the whole case for humility through the book. And at the end, he goes, and I know what you're thinking, but if I have humility, won't I be run over? And his whole thing was the answer to having healthy humility and still walking with, confidence, effectiveness in life is to have God honoring boundaries. And so Lisa Turkhurst in a meeting was like, are boundaries biblical? And it took him, and he was like, I don't know how to answer that. I think they're healthy. And so he went on a whole journey. And so I'm in the middle of reading all these chapters on it. But he just has several things. But one of the things I wanted to read, because I just thought this was interesting, this is where the balance comes in. He gives a scenario where he talks about how you have to have healthy boundaries. Like if you're at a dinner and things are going away that, and you just feel like, no, I've set a boundary. We're not going to talk about, I don't know, whatever it is, politics. And people are starting to scream and cuss. And so we've talked about, we're not going to do this. Hey, I need to step out, how to have it. But then he brought this up as a few pages later, and it's not a lie, I just want to read it. He said, earlier I talked about a difficult family dynamic and how we established boundaries that had everyone in mind. The simple consideration of other people as we establish boundaries is an example of humility on display. Now imagine that same scenario, the one you talked about earlier, and one of us instead thought, well, I need to process my thoughts and feelings whenever I want to, regardless of what others are feeling. If I can't do that freely with whoever's around, I won't even come to the family gathering. And then he says, this is an example of a boundary that lacks humility. Remember, humility is an awareness of God that allows us to know ourselves and how to relate to others. An approach to boundaries that places you as the only one who matters and disregards other people is evidence of pride, this approach will eventually cause relationships to fall apart. I just thought that was a really powerful nuance because I think the whole idea of boundaries has so consumed pop psychology now that if it's not filtered through a faith lens that's connected to humility, I think we see this all the time. There's a lot of, people that are just fresh off their first session in therapy that's like, I have realized I just don't have boundaries, and they use the boundaries language to verbally punish and kind of bully the people around them
Cut someone out of their life
Yeah,
completely.
yeah.
Or,
without any self-awareness or humility on their end. And so I just like that nuance. I never heard that of how do you have boundaries with humility?
wow.
How do you
really
have
good.
boundaries that doesn't just make you the center?
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. What were you going to say?
No, I just think you both present just some great stuff, and like your real life example of the Friday night with the game and the family. I think that's and the table with everyone talking, and I think one other thing I just want to add, and
Yeah,
I'm
what
like,
about for you?
well, that's what I was gonna say. First of all, I've had the luxury of kind of watching you guys, and then coming into I think a healthy culture for someone who works in ministry. I've had some people kind of blaze a trail in front of me, so I've been able to like pick up on some of that. Maybe I don't want to say faster, but just I've been able to see that. But just on a personal level, I think the one thing that I've learned is and it might be a weird word to say with the word boundary, but I think be flexible. And what I mean by that is, like, I can go into a situation and have a boundary in my mind for, okay, I don't want to step into this conversation, or I don't want to do that. But then I also have a realization that I cannot control other people around me. And so I can't control if, there's a long-running disagreement I have with someone and I don't really want to talk about it, and they decide to bring it up to me. I can't control it, but I can control my response in that moment. And so the boundary isn't so much about what this person does or says or whatever, but it's about my response to them and how I'm going to respond. And so I think that's a really practical thing that I've learned is like, okay, if I'm going into a situation where I could be in an uncomfortable place or I don't necessarily want to be in that, what's my response going to be to that situation? How do I be kind but also firm? And this is both, I think, an area where I've grown stronger in, but I also have a lot to learn and I'm still growing in. How do you like even think through all the scenarios and things that could happen, and you're able to like be flexible with the situation, but also say, no, this is what I believe in. And I think if you think it takes time to think through how you're going to respond in those moments. That's why I love what you said about priorities, because I think what you prioritize and what you value helps determine what your response is going to be to people around you. And I think one of the greatest problems is that we just we're so busy in our culture and in our lives that we just kind of show up to things, or we say yes to things, or we say no to things, or we feel this pressure like we have to respond right away. And I think one of the greatest things we can do is just give yourself the boundary of waiting 10 minutes before you respond to something. And take time to actually, is this something I want to do? Yes or no? Okay, if the answer is no, because I have a boundary there or whatever, how am I going to respond in a way that's empathetic? How am I going to respond in a way that's loving, but also stays firm to my boundary? And so I think that's another area where I've really tried to go. So being flexible, and then also just how do I give myself space and time to think through exactly how I feel about this before I just fire off a quick response, either yes or no or whatever.
Yeah.
That's good.
I think at the end of the day, one of the things that you said on the beginning, I think is just true. I think in general, we just as humans need more empathy than less.
Yeah.
So I think, in general, empathy to me is never a bad thing. I have yet to find in my head, just even running through, a moment where you do not see empathy on full display through the character of Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think for everything from not only love your neighbor, but love your enemy. I think about like every situation that he does, or he mentions, is about, and in fact, he says, this is how the world will know you're my disciple, how you love one another. So it was such a benchmark or a high point, like of how people know that we follow Jesus is how we love.
Yeah.
And so empathy to me should be one of the highest marks of a follower of Jesus. And
Yeah.
at the same time, obviously, we want everything to be grounded in a level of wisdom that if it causes, if you're beyond empathetic to a point where it causes detriment to something you are responsible for, or a or your family, your life, it's like, oh, I saw somebody on the side of the road and they were really struggling, so I gave them everything in the checking account. Well, that's generous and that's awesome. If God told you to do it, hey, then he'll provide. But, if you just did it because you're a bleeding heart and you do that with everybody you see, and I saw 10 people on the way into work and I gave them all, $100, and, well, I can't pay rent this month.
Well, soon they're going to need to help you.
Yeah, now you're going to be on the road asking for help, right? And so there comes a level where you need a little bit of wisdom in it.
Yeah.
But I think in general, I mean, the idea of toxic empathy is probably in the regard that we're talking about, it's a bit more of a misnomer than anything else.
Yeah.
I think we'd all agree at this table. I think you got to use wisdom. I think boundaries are a beautiful place to do it. I would say there are some boundaries in Scripture. There are in there. I don't know if he actually got to them.
He ended the conclusion with absolutely.
Yeah.
And then he builds a really powerful case for how to do it.
It'd be interesting. I've never really thought of it that way. Just a couple scenarios in the church came to my mind where there was people that the apostles said, don't associate with this person.
Brought that up.
There's 1 Corinthians 5. They got other places where it was like, these people are like, hey, if they're not going to do their, Paul said, if they're not going to share their weight, then and so there are places, I think, where there are boundaries in Scripture. But, I think in general, I think what we'd say is, I think we probably it's okay. If I'm going to err, I want to err on the side of being overly empathetic than not.
Yeah.
And I think what kind of does, at the end of the day, is kind of a sad state of, can I say, the church at large sometimes, is I feel like sometimes I see far less empathy than I feel like should match what we say we believe in.
Yeah.
Like, especially in a political year.
Yeah.
There seems to be so little empathy.
Yeah.
And that always kind of surprises me. And so sounds like it's great they're writing a book on this. Hopefully they'll write a sequel on why more empathy is needed in the church and followers of Jesus. So hopefully that will come out.
I think she's writing a sequel called Toxic Nationalism or something like that.
Yeah, maybe.
Or prequel. So, interesting. But anyways.
Okay, fun little ending thing, because one of you started grinning. I think was about to ask a question somewhat related to this. So Tim Ferriss sometimes will ask guests he has on, all right, what are the 3 books you find yourself gifting the most, that you find yourself suggesting gifting the most? What are they? So Zachary,
I can just give some of them that I have. I think probably one of the books that I have recommended the most was, believe it or not, it's probably Coddling the American Mind.
Yes.
And that's probably one that I feel like I have probably like almost every. So that book is one. Another book that as of probably the last year has probably been the number one book I've recommended.
Hope for the Wilderness?
Yeah, it's Hope for the Wilderness.
Oh, sweet.
And then number 3 on the list, I would probably say, is The Unseen Realm.
Dang it.
Yeah.
So that's just one that I have, and I see people posting pictures where they have it. I'm like, oh, we had that conversation. So 2084 is another good one. I could go on and on. There's so many different books, but I do think that those are.
Okay, let me twist this a little bit from a more of like a pastoral
development type one
perspective. Like, what do you find yourself thinking? Oh, this I really.
I'm looking through just kind of the list of. Okay, so. I mean, the problem is I have a lot of people that ask me depending on the series and things we do. And I've given a lot of recommendations based on that. So it's like I'm having a hard time just like nail down which one. A lot of them, I'm just going to say the most current thing, you know what I mean, that I've done. And so, wow. I mean, it's a good question. I don't know if I have a quick answer for that, to be honest. Like if you're thinking about like actual developmental, like, hey, you should read this book. I think this book will, because it's so specific, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it really does depend on the topic. I mean, if we're talking about work or Sabbath culture, I'm going to go to John Mark Comer, obviously, Garden City, and
that'd be your starting point for him.
Ruthless. I love Garden City because I think he does address Sabbath and things in it, but he also, I think, juxtaposes it well with what we're called to do in work and things like that. And I think Garden City is an incredible book. If it's like practical family stuff, that one that we read a couple years ago, "As the Family Habits of the Household" by Justin Whitmore Early. I think that's a really good one. I love like relationship to technology as well, and one of the leading voices on that is a guy by the name of Andy Crouch, and he wrote a book called "The Life We're Looking For: Reclaiming Relationship in a Technological-Driven World." So I think that's a really good place to start. Then my favorite spiritual formation book to recommend to people as a great starting point is one by a guy named Ronald Rolheiser called "The Holy Longing: The Search for Christian Spirituality." Such a good book.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
What about you?
That is really tough.
Yeah.
Because it really like I feel like and it sounds weird, but I so came alive when I read that about Leonard Ravenhill. They literally, especially later in his life, he considered a ministry. He would send a different book to people depending on what he felt like, because a book can change somebody's life.
Yeah.
So I love buying books for people, or like sending, and it really just depends on what's going on in their life. I do have this weird thing where, and it's probably annoying, but most people seem to appreciate it. Like I'm in the middle talking to somebody, and I'm like, "Hey, I'm so sorry. Before you forget, 2 books I think would be amazing for you," and it makes my day when some people are like, "Oh."
Let me write them down.
And they'll get them.
Yeah.
So it really depends person to person. I mean, when I look back over books that I've suggested a lot, given a lot, Calling the American Mind, there's some books that you're just like, I think the world needs to read this.
Yeah.
Calling the American Mind is one of them.
So I didn't mention it, but his newest one, Jonathan Haidt's newest one, The Anxious Generation, is even more than Calling the American Mind for me.
Really?
Is that now part of that is because of my season of life. Like it's really addressed, I think, to parents.
Especially for parents.
Yeah.
Especially
Okay.
for
Parenting is a
parenting
good
and
one.
parenting.
Yeah.
And so that one, I think every parent, every new parent in our current culture should read that book right now.
All right. Anxious Generation.
Yep.
You know, during certain periods of my life, a lot of John Bevere's theology, like I remember for about 10 years, anybody I would find out that just began to follow Jesus, I would buy them Drawing Near by John Bevere. I think Bait of Satan, for anyone struggling with offense, I would always get them that.
Yeah.
I loved his Undercover Honors Reward stuff. To me, those were foundational. There's some books like Dream to Destiny and The Blessed Life and stuff for other ones that, anyways. You know, I mean,
anyways.
over the last month or the last year, Unreasonable Hospitality. I'm like, everybody needs to read that. Oh my gosh.
I was gonna say that was one I went through here that I've recommended and
Yeah.
given to people.
I mean, there's some that are just like, you just Shoe Dog. I mean, there's just
Yeah,
some that are just like,
love
oh
Shoe
my
Dog.
gosh, you just need to read that.
I still haven't read Green Lights yet. I want to read Green
Oh,
Lights.
it's so
yeah,
good. You need to listen to Green
Yeah,
Lights.
listen.
I've heard
The-
Green
most
Lights.
Not
of
in
this-
It to Win It was a book for 3 years. I'm like, I think every Christian in America should read.
Yeah, I think I did give that one, or I think I gave that, and I think I recommended
You
that
did.
one quite
You
a bit.
recommended it.
That was just for navigating really tense political environments as a faith follower. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
what does that look like?
Yeah.
And how do I process it? So
Boundaries,
A lot of good-
The Pursuit
lot of
of
good-
God. Yep.
we just gave more than
Yep.
people have time to read for the
Yep.
next 3 months if they want to take any of them. But because that's good. I mean, I think let's all try to be more and more empathetic, but don't do it at the expense of people you love. Maybe I don't
Yeah.
know. Maybe that's
Yeah.
that's an overly simplistic way of saying it.
Yeah.
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 So,
Yeah, when your empathy is high, but you find yourself unable to draw lines that reflect your own self-respect
yeah.
for the respect of those around you, that's when you got to reassess. But yeah, hopefully let us know where this lands with you, what your struggles and successes are in this area. And until next time, we hope you have the best week, and we will see you next week.
Hey guys, it's Russ. Thanks so much for listening. We really believe if we can get around tables instead of behind screens, if we can talk to each other instead of at each other, we can make the world better. To help us do that, here are a few things you can do to help. First, if you haven't yet, leave a review on Apple or Spotify and hit subscribe on YouTube. This helps more than you know. Also, if you have been impacted by the community out of which this podcast comes, that's X Church. Maybe you're local or you've been touched by the messages and impact across the country, even the world. I want to encourage you to support this work. A powerful life principle is to invest in the people and places that invest in you. And so I want to invite you to do that right now by going to thex.church/give. You can give a one-time small gift, a sacrificial gift, or even become a recurring partner. Together, let's keep elevating the conversation, thinking higher, loving deeper, and making the world better. Cheers.